So, I've got something super exciting for you today on QuickSpeak English. You know how sometimes making phone calls in English can be like totally nerve-wracking?
Oh my goodness, yes. And this is actually something I'm really passionate about because, I've been teaching English for like over 10 years now, and phone conversations are they're absolutely one of the biggest challenges my students face.
Um, that's exactly why I wanted to dive into this topic with you today. I mean, speaking on the phone in another language is like a whole different ball game, right?
It really, really is. And the thing is, I've actually developed some amazing techniques over the years that can make anyone, and I mean anyone, feel more confident when making calls in English. You know what I mean? Like, we're talking about practical, real-world skills here that people can start using right away.
Oh, wow, that sounds super helpful. I'm really curious about these techniques you've developed.
Trust me, by the end of this episode, our listeners are going to have some really, really powerful tools to help them master phone conversations in English. Like, we're talking game-changing stuff here, you know?
So, what makes phone conversations in English particularly challenging? Like, what are the main obstacles you see your students struggling with?
Oh, well. The biggest thing, and I see this all the time, is that when you're on the phone, you lose all those visual cues, right? Like you can't see the other person's facial expressions or their body language, you know what I mean?
That's really interesting. I never thought about how much we actually rely on those visual cues.
Exactly. And there's more to it. Like when you're speaking face to face with someone, you can read their lips, right? But on the phone, you're totally relying on just the audio. And sometimes the connection isn't even that great, you know?
Oh, yeah. What about different accents? That must make things even harder.
That's actually such a huge point. Like, dealing with different accents is probably one of the biggest challenges my students face because, English is spoken all over the world, and each region has its own unique way of speaking, right? And when you add the phone element to that, it can be really overwhelming.
So what are some of the typical struggles you notice your learners dealing with?
Well, the thing is, many learners get really anxious about not being able to ask for clarification, Like, they worry that saying, "Could you repeat that?" too many times might make them sound, well, less competent. And there's also this pressure to respond quickly because nobody wants those awkward silences on the phone, right? It's like this perfect storm of challenges that can really affect someone's confidence.
So speaking of challenges, could you walk us through some of the essential phrases that people really need to know for phone conversations in English?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like, let's start with the basics, right? When you're answering a call, you've got options. You can go with something like, "Hello, this is Peter speaking." Or, and this is really common in business settings, "Peter speaking, how can I help you?"
And what about when you're the one making the call?
That's actually really important. See, when you're calling someone, you want to identify yourself right away, right? So you might say something like, "Hi, this is Peter calling from QuickSpeak English." And then immediately explain why you're calling, like, "I'm calling about."
Oh, what about those situations when you need to ask someone to wait?
Oh my goodness, yes. This is super practical stuff. So like, if you need to put someone on hold, you'd say something like, "Could you hold for a moment, please?" Or, or sometimes I tell my students to use, "Would you mind holding briefly?" And it's really important to wait for their response before actually putting them on hold, right?
Um, and what about when there are technical issues? That happens to me all the time.
Right. So this is where phrases like, "I'm sorry, but you're breaking up," or "The connection's not very good, could you speak up?" come in really handy. And sometimes you just need to be really direct and say something like, "Let me call you back. I think we have a bad connection." You know what I mean?
What about ending the call professionally?
Oh, this is crucial. Like, you want to summarize what was discussed and confirm any next steps, right? So you might say something like, "Just to confirm, I'll send you that email by tomorrow." And then wrap up with something like, "Thanks for your time," or "Have a great rest of your day." It's all about making sure everyone's on the same page, you know?
Um, you know what I've been wondering about? The whole cultural side of phone calls. Like, how different is it across English-speaking countries?
Oh, this is such a fascinating topic. So like, there are actually some pretty big differences in how people handle phone calls. And and it really depends on where you are, right? Like in American business culture, people tend to be, quite direct and get straight to the point.
Really? How does that work in practice?
So In the US, for example, people usually start with a quick, "Hi, how are you?" But they don't. They don't actually expect a detailed answer, you know? It's more like a greeting. But, and this is really interesting, in places like the UK or Australia, people might spend a bit more time on those initial pleasantries.
Um, what about the differences between business and casual calls?
That's where things get really interesting. See, with business calls, there's this whole different level of formality, right? Like, you want to be professional but not too stiff. And one thing that throws a lot of people off is that in English-speaking countries, we often use first names even in business settings, you know what I mean?
What about the tone we should use?
Oh gosh, this is super important. So like, in casual calls, you can be more relaxed, right? But in business calls, you want to strike this balance between being friendly and professional. And something I always tell my students is that it's totally fine to smile while you're talking. People can actually hear that in your voice, you know?
Tell me about ending calls. Are there cultural differences there too?
Absolutely. So like, in North American business culture, people tend to end calls pretty efficiently once the main topic is covered. But in some other English-speaking countries, and this is really fascinating, you might need to engage in a bit more small talk before wrapping up. The key is to kind of read the other person's signals, right? Follow their lead on how formal or casual they're being.
So, here's something I've been really curious about. What are some practical tips you can share for people who want to get better at phone conversations?
Oh, absolutely. You know what I found really, really helpful? It's all about preparation, right? Like one of the biggest game changers is actually writing down key points before the call. And not just for business calls, but for any important conversation, you know?
What kind of things should people write down?
So like the main topics you want to cover, right? And maybe some key phrases you might need. But here's the really cool part. Beep, 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 beep. Very. I always tell my students to keep a little notepad right next to their phone, you know? That way, you can jot down important information during the call too.
Um, what about dealing with nervousness? That's such a big issue for so many people.
Oh, this is something I'm super passionate about. So, the first thing is to remember that even native speakers get nervous sometimes, right? And one of the best confidence-building strategies is to practice. Practice with friends, with language partners, you know? Start with easier conversations and gradually challenge yourself.
Could you give us some specific examples of how to practice?
Of course. So like one really effective technique is to actually record yourself having pretend phone conversations, right? And another thing that works amazingly well is role-playing different scenarios. Like imagine you're calling to make a restaurant reservation. Or maybe you're calling about a job application, you know what I mean?
What about when things go wrong during the call?
This is such an important point. So like, the key is to stay calm and remember that it's totally okay to ask for clarification, right? And one strategy that really helps is having some go-to phrases ready, like, could you repeat that? Or, I'm sorry, but I didn't quite catch what you said. The thing is, well, everyone appreciates honesty, you know? It's way better than pretending you understood everything.
So, we've covered so much ground today about phone conversations in English. What would you say are the most important takeaways for our QuickSpeak English listeners?
You know what? I'd say there are three really, really crucial things to remember. First, it's all about preparation, right? Like having those key phrases ready and feeling confident about using them. Second, don't be afraid to ask for clarification, you know? And third, well, practice is absolutely everything.
That's super helpful. And what would you say to someone who's still feeling nervous about making calls in English?
The thing is, everyone starts somewhere, right? And I always tell my students that making mistakes is actually, like, it's totally part of the learning process, you know what I mean? The more calls you make, the more comfortable you'll get. It's really, really just about taking that first step.
Any final words of encouragement for our listeners?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the thing about phone conversations is that they're such an important skill in today's world, right? And every single conversation you have is making you better. So like, start small, maybe with a friend or even practicing with voice messages. The key is to just keep going, you know? Before you know it, you'll be handling those calls like a pro.
Well, that's all the time we have for today on QuickSpeak English. Thanks so much for sharing all these amazing insights, Peter.
Always a pleasure. And remember, everyone, you've got this. Just take it one conversation at a time, right?
Second paragraph in the dialogue. In this episode of QuickSpeak English, we're diving deep into mastering phone conversations in English. It's something I've always struggled with, so I'm really excited to, get some tips from you, Lily.
Oh, I'm so excited to share what I know. And it's like really not as scary as you think. Phone calls, they're conversations, right? But we can definitely make them smoother and more confident. First point, preparation is key. And that's like super important, really.
Preparation? Okay, so what kind of preparation are we talking about here? Like, should I write a script? That sounds a bit intense.
Not necessarily a full script, but, jotting down key points, main things you want to discuss. That's really helpful. And then like think about the purpose of the call, right? What do you want to achieve? And maybe even anticipate some questions you might be asked and prepare some answers. It's like totally doable.
Okay, I can see how that would help. Less frantic, more, controlled. So what's next?
Next, well, the thing is clear and concise speech. And that's really important. You need to, speak slowly and clearly, enunciate your words, avoid slang and complicated grammar. Simple sentences are your friends, and try to pause between your sentences to let the other person absorb everything. It makes everything much easier to understand.
Right. Slow and clear makes total sense. But what if I get nervous and start speaking too fast? It happens,
Totally. It happens to everyone, right? So practice beforehand. Practice makes perfect, like even practicing with a friend or even talking to yourself, You can record yourself and listen to your own phone calls. Really, really helps.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that. Recording myself. That's actually pretty clever. Okay, so we've got preparation and clear speech. What else?
And then active listening. And then that's like super important too. Pay attention to what the other person's saying. Really listen. Don't just think about your next point. You have to be present, and ask clarifying questions and make sure you really understand everything.
Yeah, I sometimes just sort of zone out when I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. Definitely something I need to work on. So active listening, great. What about ending the call?
The outro. That's crucial too. Always summarize the key points, reiterate any agreements made, and confirm next steps. And always thank the person for their time and end the call politely. It's like basic politeness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap, we have preparation, clear speech, active listening, and a polite ending. And practice, right? That's the golden key, right? It seems pretty straightforward, actually.
Exactly. And don't forget to smile while you're talking. Even if they can't see you, your voice changes. It makes a difference, really. It's like your voice can transmit positive energy, It's kind of magical. Speaking of magical, I've been practicing my magic tricks lately. Did I ever tell you about the time I made a rabbit disappear from my phone call? I was really proud of it. Anyway, you'll get the hang of it soon enough.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. I can't wait to see your rabbit disappear. So yeah, thanks for all the tips, Lily. This has been so helpful and I feel like much more confident about making phone calls now.
Absolutely. You got this. Remember, practice, practice, practice. And listen to QuickSpeak English again and again. It could help. You'll be a phone call pro in no time. And always remember to smile. Bye.
Thanks so much, Lily. Bye.